Have you ever looked back on your early childhood and wondered which memories were real and which were figments of your overactive imagination? Have you ever had a memory that you thought might have been a dream? Our minds can do terrible things to us, and so can people. I'm not sure which one traumatized me for most of my childhood. I remember despising kindergarten. I went to Duggan Elementary School in Farner, Tennessee. Naturally, I hated it. But by the end of the year, my feelings went beyond simple hatred. Inexplicable memories from those days still pop into my head from time to time. I remember hearing and seeing things that were too strange to comprehend. I only have vague images and sounds in my head that I can barely remember. I don't have nightmares anymore. What scares me the most is remembering how I felt in those moments. I recently found an old photo album with pictures from my kindergarten class. It took me back in time. I recognized the picture of my teacher. He was a very elderly man we called Mr. Atsushi. There was something about him that seemed off. He didn't seem very nice to children. Every day, he drove to school in a long white van. It was called the stupid van because all the kids hated it. Mr. Atsushi was irritable and irascible, but he knew how to behave when he was being watched by other teachers or the principal. One day at home, I remember my mom telling me that one of my classmates was missing. She was watching the news and was understandably very upset. When the second child in my class went missing, my mom abruptly pulled me out of school. She said she would bring me back when it was safe. I thought it was great to be out of school. I was too young to realize what it really meant to have a child disappear, too naive to think about it realistically. I remember coming back after a while. The kids had been found, but they hadn't returned to school for some reason. One of my fellow students told me that the children who had disappeared didn't remember anything about what had happened. She said they were cut below the navel and sewn up. She knew the two children well. I think her name was Katie or Kitty or something like that. I just figured she was being completely dishonest. Even as a 6-year-old kid, I wasn't naive enough to believe such a thing. Later that year, I remember a girl, let's simply refer to her as Katie, talking about how one of the children who had gone missing earlier had passed away. Because of this, she took a week off from school. Apparently, she kept in touch with the two children after they moved to another school. Katie said the child had been unwell since they were found with no memory. At this point, I thought she was making up another deceive to get attention, but now that I think about it, she really did look miserable. Little kids aren't that good at acting. I remember having a dreadful nightmare once. The day started out normal. I remember going to lunch, and I think I remember getting up to leave after the bell rang for class. I'm not sure what happened next, because that's the last thing I remember before I had the nightmare. Suddenly, I was on a table, strapped in. The narrow walls on either side of me showed tinted windows, and it was all pretty dark. I was in a very cramped rectangular room. I just sat there for a moment. I clearly remember looking around and feeling the straps around my wrists and ankles. I looked away from me, and there was a tray of surgical instruments. I didn't know how I even ended up there. I was confused and on the verge of tears. A man dressed as a doctor approached me. I couldn't see his face because it was very dark. He just stared at me for a while and then turned on a bright light that he had set up above me, the kind they use at the dentist. He was wearing a doctor's mask and had a blank expression on his face. I was stunned with fear. He carelessly reached for the scalpel and took one from the tray. I started screaming and crying. He looked slightly taken aback. The man spoke a few words, but I couldn't make out what he said. I woke up to Mr. Atsushi's harsh scolding. I was fast asleep on the bleachers in the gymnasium while waiting for our bus numbers to be called. He told me that I had fallen asleep and missed my bus. He took me back to his classroom and called my mom to pick me up. I started crying as soon as I had time to think about the dream. He didn't try to comfort me, didn't even ask me what my problem was. He just looked at me. I told him that I'd had a dreadful nightmare, and he nodded at me. At least I think he did. My mom spent all afternoon trying to calm me down. The most disturbing thing is that I usually wake up from a nightmare as soon as I start to feel the horror. But in this case, I was screaming and thrashing around the room for a long time. It all felt real. Over the years, I became convinced that I was hallucinating. I started homeschooling because I was very afraid of going back. My parents couldn't understand how a nightmare could cause a person to have the problems I had. I had several dreams about the experience. It wasn't like a repetitive nightmare. These nightmares were much less real than my original nightmare. It was just the original experience in the form of a dream. They say that the sense of smell is the best way to remember something. Many years later, as an adult, I visited my grandfather in the hospital. Something about the smell brought me back. It made me think of that dark room. I went to my parents' house and flipped through some old photo albums, looking for something to pique my curiosity. Looking through a photo album, I found a picture of the class and Mr. Atsushi. There was something written on the back, but not in English. Atsushi is a Japanese name, so I guessed it was in Japanese. I knew one of my dad's friends spoke Japanese, so I took the picture to him, and he translated it for me. I looked under the original text and saw the scribbles the man had left behind. The translation read, "I had a great time studying with you this school year." I went back to the photo album and started frantically rummaging through it. I didn't want my dream to become a reality, but I had to know for sure. There were pictures of me doing all sorts of activities. I even found a picture of the moment when my mom brought my class cupcakes for my birthday. Almost every picture had Mr. Atsushi in it with a stern expression on his face. I picked up one photo, the one my mom took of me during the school play, and it seemed thicker than the others. On the edge of the photo, I noticed scotch tape. The two photos were actually glued together. I took a knife and cut the two photos apart. What I saw amazed me. Underneath the plain photo was a picture of a little boy tied to a table in the dark. I compared the photo to the others, and it was me. I looked at the back of the play picture. It was originally facing the picture of me on the table, and it had more Japanese words written on it. I had to sit down. The fear and paranoia were coming back to me. I took the letter to the same man who translated the first note. He looked completely confused by what he read. I came to this country to continue what I started in Manchuria.